This is the first reading of the story, The Everlasting Wonka. This is my attempt to take the writings of Roald Dahl and continue with an idea of what might take place following his Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. The last words in that saga of Charlie's adventures are, "It's not over yet. It hasn't even begun." With that in mind, and with all due respect to author Roald Dahl, I take great pleasure and ask for a little poetic license to go on with Charlie's Inheritance. Please consider this a type of fan fiction. The Everlasting Wonka, Chapter 1. It Hasn't Even Begun. What happened to Charlie Bucket after his amazing trip to Wonka's chocolate factory and his stupendous ride on the glass elevator? Do you recall? He became heir to the chocolate factory and had a lot to learn before Mr. Wonka left it all behind. Mr. Wonka loved Charlie and his entire family. He cherished them so much he moved them in to live in the chocolate factory. Having Charlie's mom and dad there, as well as his 4 grandparents available, offered a little structure, order, and a lot of love to an otherwise chaotic life as experienced in Wonkaland. As Charlie and Mr. Wonka sat and brainstormed for hours at a time, they came up with some of the most unbelievable and innovative ideas, new concepts that required changes, updates that improved the factory and its distribution of the best chocolate in the world, incomparable types of sweets that could be only produced by them. It wasn't all fun and games, however. Oh no. There were the normal difficulties with merchants, some customers, and competing companies. And although Mr. Wonka thought he had taken care of all the challenges, dealing with spies trying to steal his ingredients and ideas, something occurred that upset his whole system. Much to his dismay, one of his best Oompa Loompas requested a vacation to return to his homeland. But instead, the Oompa Loompa traveled to other candy factories and chocolate investors, sharing not only secrets, he also sold other information about Mr. Wonka's future plans. When Mr. Wonka found out about this, his heart sank to think he would be betrayed by an Oompa Loompa. When the police asked if he wanted to press charges for this invasion of copyright and trademarks, Mr. Wonka just said, No, of course not. I can't possibly press charges and let my poor Oompa Loompa family member and friend spend the rest of his life in prison. Rather, Mr. Wonka allowed the Oompa Loompa trader to return to live in the factory. How grateful that Oompa Loompa was! What would prison be like for such a small and different person? Still, Mr. Wonka felt so hurt because one of his workers couldn't keep secrets. We'll hear more about that lucky Oompa Loompa later. But first, let's catch up on how Charlie and his family settled in with Mr. Wonka. Charlie's Grandpa Joe became a completely different person, and as his other 3 grandparents finally got out of bed, they were like kids again. Unfortunately, their bodies had spent so much time running that it was impossible, even with Mr. Wonka's Vita-Wonk, to make them physically stronger. Mr. Wonka was heard to say, "To live forever seems such bliss, but true peace comes when death you kiss." In response, Charlie started coming up with his own sayings, such as, "Live long and be blessed, but know someday you'll finally rest." They had lived full lives, and Charlie had grown so much as the years flew by. He kept getting older, but remained bright-eyed. He knew and appreciated what it meant to be alive and have the opportunity to do whatever he put his mind to. Even though living in the factory was like living in a world where nothing was impossible, Charlie, like all of us, had to witness the death of his grandparents. He watched them fail, but it was not painful for them at all. Oh, heavens no, not with the invention that Mr. Wonka was able to put to use. Mr. Wonka made sure that each of them received transfusions of the purest chocolate, made to stimulate the all-natural endorphins their bodies produced, giving them the feeling of falling in love. Charlie said his goodbyes as they smiled and went, not in peace, but in true bliss. Charlie also watched his parents change with age. He noticed Mr. Wonka was becoming more frail and elderly too. He knew those adults' minds just didn't work as effectively as they used to. Sometimes he longed to just be alone and have complete control of his life and the management of the factory. Life inside the chocolate factory kept him young at heart, but he found himself not just maturing, but gaining physical aches and pains that accompany the wear and tear of all human bodies. As children do, they become adults. He also became wiser and clever. Well, as some children do when they become adults. One day, alone, Charlie entered the chocolate room. Usually, he and Mr. Wonka joined each other on this morning stroll, so that what a shock it was to find Mr. Wonka laying on the bank of the chocolate river. In full dismay, Charlie yelled for help. The Oompa Loompas were just waking up, but ran to Charlie's aid. Mr. Wonka was fading fast. Charlie flipped him over and away from the edge of the river. Mr. Wonka just looked up at Charlie with his tired eyes and managed to get out the words, "This is it, Charlie." Charlie coughed and began to cry. "No, Mr. Wonka, no!" "Oh, yes, my dear boy." And then, with a smile, he made his best attempt to signal the Oompa Loompas. They all surrounded him as Charlie tried to stay close, touching Mr. Wonka. In frustration, Charlie anxiously yelled, "What are you doing? Mr. Wonka, what are they doing?" Mr. Wonka just smiled again and whispered, "It's okay, Charlie. Things have to be this way. It's really the only way." Charlie stood by, paralyzed with fear, watching the Oompa Loompas move Mr. Wonka closer to the edge of the flowing chocolate river. "Charlie?" Mr. Wonka called in a raspy voice. Yes, what is it, sir?" "Let them." And then Charlie realized what they were doing. They were going to throw Mr. Wonka into the river. He would surely drown. He was barely breathing by this time. When Charlie tried to stop them, several of the Oompa Loompas surrounded him, making him fall to the ground as they tripped him up. Charlie got up on his knees and reached out his hand toward Mr. Wonka, but it was too late. After accomplishing their mission, the little Oompa Loompas ran away, singing some song in gibberish. Charlie scolded them. "What have you done? Why? Why would you do that? Have you all gone completely mad?" Mr. Wonka floated on his back, just as if he were taking a nap, with his arms raised up under his head. As the current took him away, he was able to call to Charlie, "It's okay. It's all yours now." The Oompa Loompas continued to sing as Charlie ran toward the hidden door that held the special monitoring room set up to see every part of the factory inside and out. Charlie heard the Oompa Loompas singing the song they had been saving for just this moment. To live is bliss, what did you miss? Or did you cry an alibi? You know someday you'll have to pay. And this, my friend, is the end. It was short and sweet, but that was what Mr. Wonka was all about. On to chapter 2.